how long have you been in the technology field and what was your first IT related job?
Since 1978, 79. And my first job was as a programmer for a set of educational programs to teach um, people at the University of Illinois, the employees at the University of Illinois, how to do appropriate maintenance and cleaning in in the labs and various areas of the university. So that's when it started. And that got started because I went and visited the computer center and got intensely interested in that. And then I found somebody that gave me access to an online game. This is back in the late 70s, way before the consumer internet that we know it today. But we were playing as groups and teams on the computer, and that pulled me in, and I got interested in the fact that you could talk to somebody from Australia and be sitting in Illinois, all the way on the other side of the world and have a conversation with them. Or you could drop a note into what we call notes files to them and ask a question and get somebody to answer it. And usually it was somebody that wrote a book or, was a professor of it. So it was really fascinating to me, all the communication capabilities of the computer, much less the fact that, they were fun and interesting and you could educate people with them as well. So that was the beginning. Went from there to being an operator on the system. So I made sure that the computer stayed up and running, and we did backups and all that. So this was for a mainframe that filled, almost one whole floor of the building that I was in. And then after that, I started programming and coding some games for a local company that was a startup that got killed by the fact that the TI-994A got discontinued by Texas Instruments. That was back in 1980, I think it was. And things just kind of snowballed from there. I got a job at a startup in Ohio, which I learned something from and left after 30 days, and then took a job at a startup in Boston, which turned out to be incredibly fortunate for me. At that startup, it was an MIT professor had started that company, and it was an educational software company. So I was coding and ended up taking over the whole programming department, and then left the company as the professor kind of had some personal problems and issues, and I stepped out of that and started consulting. But during that whole time frame being in Boston, I ended up getting connected to a lot of the people who were instrumental in the early growth of the internet. This would have been in 1981 and 82, right before and during the switchover from an old networking protocol to the current internet protocol, TCP/IP. I remember everybody turned the switch and held their breath because they didn't know if it was all going to connect up or they were going to have to revert back, but it all worked. So yeah, after when I was at AT&T doing consulting there and starting up the first intranet using TCP/IP, in fact, became probably the largest network at the time because it was nearly worldwide. But I left doing that and came to Washington, D.C. area, where the company that I had at the time, which was called Learning Tree Software, took over the engineering work for a educational company. I think it was called Industrial Training Corporation. It was based in Maryland, then they moved down to Virginia. But in any case, during the time of doing that, friends of mine that I'd met in Boston who were had left MIT and had started a company called FTP Software. They needed to have or wanted to have their software or TCP/IP and the protocols, Telnet, and all that on a Macintosh. And so I flew up to Boston and met with them, and we worked out a deal. And I was pretty far down working through that deal, about 4 months, if I recall. And they called up and said, basically, we don't really want to do that. We're just going to stick to the PC. And I said, well, then you don't mind if I take off and do the Macintosh side of things? And they're like, yeah, sure, fine, go ahead. And we stayed close friends and collaborated throughout the period of time that both companies were around. So it was very good relationship. But I started a company at that point called Intercon, and Intercon took what was at the time NCSA Telnet. NCSA, as you'll recall, had something called Mosaic. NCSA it was National Center for Supercomputing at University of Illinois. So I went back to my old alma mater where I went to college at, and got them to release that software into the public domain. So we took that, rewrote the manual, created a little better manual, did packaging for it. I hired a gentleman by the name of Gage Paulson, who was one of the original, probably the guy who wrote most of NCSA Telnet, from the University of Illinois. Got him to, he asked him what he thought was needed to be added, and he came up with several ideas. So we consulted with him and created those, and he came on board and led the engineering team for Intercon. So we were at the first, some of the first conferences. Interop went from being really just a conference to make sure your software worked with everybody else's software to being a behemoth. I mean, a really huge conference later in the 90s. But, we were very, very early, very, very lucky in the fact that basically people were ignoring the Macintosh in favor of the PC, and left us a pretty clear path. We had our own PC product, but it really never took off. We had a Sun product, really never took off. But we created what we called TCP Connect, which had mail, Telnet, and all the internet protocols at the time that you really needed to connect to the internet. When the web started, when HTML came out and web servers and World Wide Web was first starting, we looked at taking software Mosaic from NCSA Telnet. The engineering team decided that they could build their own better. Turns out history, is what it is. We had awesome engineers, but the weight of the installed base for that particular software really kind of carried it through, and that software became the basis for Netscape and for Microsoft's web browser as well. But during that time, we got contacted by AOL. We built a web browser, the AOL's first web browser that was embedded inside of their software, and that was a pretty fun project. I mean, it's a pretty hard project, but it's pretty fun. We also created a bunch of other things like, SMTP servers for the Macintosh, and NFS, which is Network File System. It was one of the early file sharing protocols out there that Sun had developed, and was part of Unix. And that we pulled all that together on the Macintosh, and really sold the heck out of it. In the early 90s, it became clear, and looking at sales, that we were not selling hardly any software to Japan, and I couldn't really figure out why. This is prior to the EU, the European Union. So Japan at that time was the second largest economy in the world behind the US, and we couldn't figure out why all this technology that came from Japan, yet they weren't using any of the networking. So I spent about 6 weeks over in Japan, traveling around with our distributor there, meeting people, and came to the realization that basically, unlike the US, where there were multiple national ISPs, PSINet, UUNet, Digex, all out there selling commercial connectivity to the internet, there really wasn't anything like that in Japan. It just did not exist. And in further research, we found out that basically the Japanese government, because they'd gotten a little bit into trouble with the US government regarding cell phones and protocols and companies around that they were hesitant to give any licenses to Japanese companies to sell the internet. So we decided to start a company there. It was called Intercon International, or IKK. And that company went through the process, got a telecom license for international, got a telecom license so that we could connect local data lines into the international internet. We created a domain called inter.net with the idea that we could do, Sony.inter.net or whatever, because .coms were not generally thought of as anything being used outside of the US, and that kind of came along later. But I'll never forget being yelled at by several Japanese professors that we should just get the heck out of, they weren't quite that polite, get the heck out of Japan and go back to the US and let a Japanese company do it. But what they didn't realize is that politically, the Japanese government was unwilling to let the first internet company in Japan be a non-US based company. So we became that non-US based company. We did a partnership with ATT Gens, which is the Japanese subsidiary of AT&T, and they helped us get the internet connectivity, T1 lines, and that we shared the costs on that. That turned out to be a very good deal for both of us. We landed the connectivity with PSINet in the US. Funny story about that is that they did not believe that we would be able to start a company and get internet services connected up in Japan. So they kind of laughed at me when I asked them about that several months earlier. But when I came to them with a real live connection with a T1 from Tokyo, they were pretty excited about that. Ultimately, that led to PSINet buying not only the Japanese subsidiary, or IIKK, but that also they purchased my company from the Intercon. That would have been in 1995, I believe. That deal turned out to be pretty good. We executed that. I came on board to run the consumer division of PSINet. I ran that for about 9 months until AT&T entered the market and said they were going to give away internet services for free. Nobody, including our board, read the fine print that said, yeah, we'll give it to you for free, but you have to spend $350 a month in long distance services in order to get it free, right? So it was never free, but they did such a good job marketing it and scared the hell out of all of the ISPs that they were going to come into this consumer market and kill it, that our board made the decision, PSINet's board made the decision to sell that division off. I think that was a huge mistake even today, but I'm not the one making the decision. I'm just the guy that was executing on the plan. So they sold that off to MindSpring, which then became Earthlink and a few other companies, and that lasted for quite a number of years. They did quite well. I was actually, that acquisition sort of put them on the map. I left PSINet after, let's see, it would have been about another 9 months. And then I decided that it was time to leave because PSINet was becoming too much of a telecom and not a small startup, scrappy internet company anymore, which makes sense because they were, doing $6 billion a year in business. At some point, you've got to switch gears and change it up. So I left and started investing in some small companies, small internet companies. One of the companies I invested in, it's called WebCal. WebCal got bought by Yahoo and went on to become the basis for Yahoo's personal information manager for really the next almost 15 to 18 years. I think it's only about 2-3 years ago that they actually shut down that part of the service, and that code went away. So that's pretty exciting. Then after that had happened, I was looking for sort of the next thing to do, and PSINet approached me again, said, "Hey, we bought all these consumer companies all over the world, and we don't know what to do with them. We don't get value out of them. How about you come on board and we spin it out, and Goldman Sachs will take it public?" Well, it's kind of hard to refuse that in 1999, given the froth of the internet, how much money was being made, and sort of how easily all those companies were going public. So I officially dove in January 1st, 2000. That was quite an interesting and fun experience, pulling companies. They had bought about 80 companies worldwide in about 25 countries. And so we did a lot of flying around internationally to kind of do the separation of, down the line, everybody on this side is consumer, everybody on that side is enterprise, and we, split the baby, so to speak. That was a lot of fun. That was probably one of the more exciting parts of my business life. And met a lot of really good people, still stay in connection with a lot of them, and that was quite interesting. However, we flew right into the teeth of the internet bubble bursting. I'll never forget. I was walking down the street in Hong Kong and talking to one of my partners back in the States, and I said, "Hey, I read this morning that." I think it was like Mike.com. It was somebody's name.com. It was like 4-letter name. It went public in Hong Kong earlier that day, and they had people lined up for blocks and blocks and blocks to buy shares at the IPO. And they do things a little differently there than in the US. And its valuation out the door was like $5 billion, which, today seems small given some of the unicorns that are out there that, people keep investing hundreds of millions of dollars into and are, trying to spin up businesses. But this one was truly, they had rented a floor of an office building. They had hired like 20 engineers, had bought the domain, and that's literally all they had. And yet they went out and became public at a huge valuation. And my conversation was like, this is the top. There is nowhere to go but down from here. And I would, it'd been nice to say I paid attention to my own idea. I didn't quite, because I got caught out in the downdraft. But about 2-3 weeks later, that's when the crash happened. It was quite spectacular. And Goldman Sachs went from talking to us daily to basically telling us never to call them again. So, easy come, easy go, as it were. So my partner and I spent the next 9 months trying to find investment. We were looking to raise about $50 million to pull that thing together and give it the marketing that it needed to grow. We had 3.5 million users worldwide, which was a pretty big chunk of users. We never got the investment. All the investors were saying if it has internet in the name or does internet business, we're not interested until everything falls out and we see where the path forward is. So my partner and I bought that from PSINet. About 3-4 months later, PSINet declared bankruptcy. One of the fallout from the bubble bursting was their death. The other companies, UUNet and Digex, all got bought by big telcos because they realized that these companies were going to kill them if they didn't buy them, so they ended up buying them. After that, we ran, we called it Inter.net, because we bought the domain back as part of the company, which is kind of full circle for me from early 90s and having Inter.net as the domain for the Japanese entity. So that was kind of a fun thing to do on a personal level. Ran that for several years. My partner and I decided to divide up the baby. He had one idea of what he wanted to do. I had a different idea of what I wanted to do. We ended up on the pieces I got, we ended up selling a big chunk of that in Canada to a Canadian public company where I was chairman of the board for a while, and then left because it was just time for me to start looking at other things to do. In 2009, I was helping consult with startups, helping them figure out their business plan and things like that. And I met a gentleman who's one of the owners and CEO of AIS Network, and we got together and bought AIS Network. Together, it took us looking at about 300 companies before we found the one that actually financially made sense and didn't have a lot of skeletons in the closet. That was a very educational process. Jay and I bought that, running AISN today. Along the way, we've managed to convert the company from being mainly a commercial concern to having a large presence in state government, running websites and programming applications and things like that for the state governments. And that brings me to today. We have a growing good business, and very excited to see where it's going to go from here. Did I put you to sleep, Morgan?
No, that was actually super educational and really cool to listen to. So thank you.
You're welcome.